This lesson provides some help in troubleshooting group policy application and some of the more advanced configurations you may see in environments. Typically, when a user logs on, the user's policy comes from the organizational unit where that user object sits, while the computer group policy comes from the organizational unit where the computer object sits. Now, suppose you have a kiosk environment. We have a set of computers where any user can log on, but you want to very strictly control those machines. It's possible to configure a loopback processing mode. So when you enable the loopback processing mode for a group policy object, when this is set to enabled, it will actually use the group policy object settings for the users in the group policy objects linked at the computer's OU and domain, rather than where the user's object sits. So this is saying any user configurations you define in the group policy objects that are linked to the computer's organizational unit and domain hierarchy would be applied to the user instead of where the user's object sits. Now, this is if you use mode replace. You can also say merge, so this would use both the computer user configurations and the configuration set for the user's object as well. So this is something to be aware of because this may confuse the group policy objects you see configured. So always look, is loopback processing mode enabled for a group policy object? If it is, the user is getting those settings that are defined for where the computer object sits rather than where their user object sits. Another item that can confuse is when does group policy actually refresh? I've changed group policy, why isn't a user seeing it? So remember that standard machines, domain member computers, and users refresh every 90 minutes with a randomizing offset of up to 30 minutes, which avoids a storm of everyone refreshing their policy at the same time. Now, domain controllers refresh every 5 minutes, they're far more frequent. Some settings don't apply in this refresh though. Think of software installation, think of a folder redirection. You wouldn't want that happening just at some random time throughout the day. So software installations, folder redirections only apply either machine startup or logon, depending on if it's defined for the computer or the user object. Other types of policies can be configured should they refresh or not during a standard policy refresh. Remember, as a user, I can always force a refresh using GP update. So on this machine, I can type GP update. Now I can be more granular. I can say, for example, only update, target the computer part or only the user part. But I can just say, we'll do both. Now by default, the only policy that will be applied are policies that have changed since the last application. So if nothing's changed, nothing will happen. I can also say /false. This will reapply everything, but this may mean I have to log off or even restart the machine for those changes to take effect. To see the policies I have, I can use GP result. And you can see here GP result has a number of switches. So just to see at a high level of what settings I'm getting, I can use /r. And this will show me, well, for the user, these are the settings. This is what's considered a slow link. These are the applied group policy objects. These were the ones that weren't applied because they were filtered out through some reason. So disabled, not applied, denied, all the values of why. What groups am I a member of? So this is giving me the information about what was actually configured. I can actually get far more detail. So I can say /h and get a report file. So this is now going to give me a lot more information of not just what was applied, but what were the actual settings that were applied for me. So I can now just say report. It's going to load it up in the web browser and I can now see the detail. So this is now dynamic. So I can scroll through and see, well, all the different settings I got. So apply GPOs. Okay, drive map. What did that give me? Okay, this is the information about that. These are the ones with the denied. Interesting. Here's the settings I got. So under preferences, here are the settings. So I got a drive map of S. Folder options. I can see that it's that drive map. I can see general. Okay, these are some of those preferences I defined. Don't hide extensions for known types. I can see other policies that have been applied. So I can go through and see where these were defined and the group policy objects that were defining them. I can see WMI filters, so I get a lot of information. I can view that also on a server. Through the group policy management console, I can actually run group policy results. So here's a common one I've defined in the past. I can say rerun query, and it's going to show me, well, what would user John on this machine actually get? So here's a graphical view of the summary of what the user's getting. And I can see the exact details, the actual settings as well, the same content as that report. I can do modeling. So modeling allows me to say, well, what if scenarios? What if I say a user is a member of these groups on this machine and it has these different attributes? What would happen then? So great modeling capabilities. Now, one of the things you keep seeing here is slow link. So a slow link essentially allows us to control which policy should apply or not. And by default, a slow link is anything slower than 500 kilobits per second. But I can change that. I can go in and define, well, what is a slow link in my environment? Now, by default, any security settings, administrative templates are applied even on a slow link. But any software installation, any scripts, any folder redirection is not applied, because those tend to typically use up more bandwidth, so we don't want to apply those things. So that's really what the slow link is all about. And I can say more information, and it's giving me the details of, well, what exactly do these things mean? So let's talk about trouble with group policy application. You're not seeing what you thought on a client. So always run GP result. Always make sure you've refreshed policy and view, are the policies being applied that you thought? And if not, it should give you an idea of why not. The most common cause of group policies not applying really relates to the way group policy objects are stored. Remember, group policy is stored in two ways. If I go to my domain controller and I look at my sysvol folder, I have my policies. This is the GUID of each policy. So this is the bulk of the policy, the configuration settings, exactly what is going on in there. But I also have an element that's stored in the Active Directory. So if I go to my domain, system, policies, I also have information in here. And this has to match. Remember, if I change a group policy object, it creates a new version. So the version in Active Directory must match the version on the file system. And they're replicating using different means. The Active Directory is replicating using multi-master replication. The data on the file system is most likely replicating using distributed file system replication. And their schedules may be off a little bit. So it is actually quite common to see some problems with versions not matching. As long as it's not all the time, you can expect those. Now the good news is the Group Policy Management Console does actually give you some hints here. I can actually see the status, and I can see overall my replication is in sync between this baseline domain controller and my two other domain controllers. And I can say detect now, and it will go and check if anything's actually getting out of sync. So this is a nice health check. I can also check on specific group policy objects. So if I look at a group policy object, for example, my BitLocker policy, it tells me it's GUID. So here I can actually go and look at this. The versions must match. So I can see this is the ID. On the file system, I can go and look for that object. So 6B5A. There it is. And I can see the version. It's version 8. And that should match exactly what I'm seeing here. Version 8. Then I see the version in Active Directory as well. So that 6B5, and I view the properties, and there's a version attribute, and that's version 8 as well. So that's what I want to see. I want to make sure they are in sync. If they're not in sync, then that's going to be a problem. That group policy would not apply. So you need to work out why they aren't in sync. If it's the version on the file system is newer, there's a problem with Active Directory replication. You can look at repadmin, repelmon to see why Active Directory is not replicating. If it's the file system, you could use DFS management to go and see, well, why is sysvol not replicating correctly? You'd have to literally go and troubleshoot. And that's the key problem you typically see with why group policy is not applying. If you've made sure the permissions are right, WMI filters, you're not using block inheritance and no override, typically it's a mismatch in versions between what's in Active Directory and what's actually on that file system. So to fix it, you have to fix the underlying cause of the problem, either fixing that DFSR replication or fixing that multi-master replication between domain controllers. But remember, especially if this is a remote site that's maybe replicating every 15 minutes, it's very common that you will see the odd discrepancy between the version of AD and the file system because they're replicating at slightly different times. So that's actually fine. You can also troubleshoot using the event log. So if I go to a machine that's having a problem, it's not getting the settings, fire up Event Viewer, go to Applications and Services Logs, Microsoft, Windows, Group Policy, and then Operational, it's going to show me information about any problems. So I've got an error here, completed branding extension processing in 15 milliseconds. There was an error. Informational, warnings. So I can go in here and get some details of what might be happening in my environment. But again, running that GP result, doing those modelings, making sure you're not overusing those block inheritance, those no overrides, those WMI filters, those security. They all complicate things. They all make it a bit harder to troubleshoot and work out why you're not seeing what you want to see. This concludes the session on troubleshooting group policy application and some of the common causes of problems.